one of the things that we like to do on the show, everybody, is introduce you guys to things that are on the periphery of real estate. So not just, bricks and mortar, buildings, management, leasing, buying and selling and mortgages. We like to introduce you guys to people who are contributing to, real estate plans, projects. And one of those folks is David Aaronson. Welcome to the show, David. And David owns a company called Refuel Electric Vehicle Solutions, which installs, and you guys that follow the show, you've seen David before, but REVS installs charging stations for electric vehicles at apartment complexes all over the country. David, Happy New Year, man. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Andrew. Happy New Year to everyone. Doing really good. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so
looking
absolutely.
forward to this
We were
year.
just talking, off air before we got on here about the cold snap that's getting ready to, come across the country. And you guys, we look a little bit different today. It's funny. David's in the studio in Houston. I'm actually on location in Memphis where we have a big portfolio. We're trying to prepare for that cold weather. Is there anything that you can do, David? I've got some questions for you about development. Is there anything you can do from an infrastructure standpoint or need to do with electric, charging stations with the cold coming in?
Well, the actual charging stations are supposed to work down to 20 degrees below zero. So
oh, wow. Okay.
I think the only thing I can do is keep my fingers crossed. We have stations up in 11 states, and they're as far north as Massachusetts, and on the East Coast, and the state of Washington on the West Coast. So I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed. This is the first real cold snap we've had of the year, but the charging stations should be fine.
Assuming the grid has power, you ought to be able to charge your car. David, how can you guys do a lot of consulting in assisting, owners and managers in preparing for EV charging installations? How can owners, as they're kind of thinking about that development process, at what point do they need to involve, your team into this process? There's a lot of people doing this right now. How early do you start?
Ideally, we would start, Andrew, at the very beginning when they're starting to talk to their architect and trying to decide how many stations they should be putting up, and then of course working with the electrical engineering team to make sure that we get enough power to the place, to the proper locations to power the charging stations. It's not just about serving the needs when the property opens, but this property is going to be functional for 40, 50 years, and during that time frame we're going to see almost 100% adoption at these apartment properties of people driving electric vehicles, and they will want to get their car refueled where they live. It's the most convenient place. So it's not just about what we're doing today. We look to future-proof the property, and it's important to have somebody like a company like REVS involved in the very beginning. And the real reasons is we deal with all products, we deal with all vendors, and if you deal with the specific vendor who's giving you some advice as to what they should be doing, they're only looking at their product, and they don't know what other products are on the market. And so a company like REVS operates a network where we have right now a half a dozen different companies who we're running product for.
Interesting. Is the adoption, you mentioned, 100% adoption by the people who live in apartments driving electric vehicles, which I totally agree with. When I was living in an apartment in Houston, we had 3 or 4 electric vehicles, and that was years ago. Are you seeing the developers, are 100% of the developers that are working on, new build out of the ground construction, are they considering electric vehicle charging stations? Or is it, based on class A, class B? How does that look from a development standpoint on people looking at this as a solution?
Yeah, surprisingly, Andrew, they are not all looking at putting up EV charging stations. And so there are some, it's really surprising to me because you're basically building in some functional obsolescence to your property if you're not planning to have EV charging stations at your property. So it's something that every property needs to have. If they don't need it today, they should be putting the infrastructure in, even if they don't have demand, because it's a lot less expensive to do it during construction than it is once the property has been completed.
Yep. You mentioned, getting involved really early in the process when they're talking to architects. What are the milestones on when an apartment, building is being developed? What are the milestones from your perspective along the way as that project develops?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by milestones.
So I
If you
guess
can
I guess
elaborate on that.
phase one is the building gets the plans come back from the architect. You guys look at those plans and outline where the electrical infrastructure needs to go. And then when we break ground, when does your team get involved to build it? When do you install? When do you top it out? I guess with the chargers.
I got
Like
you.
how does that play out, and
I
how you
got you.
interact with the general contractor and when you come in and that kind of thing?
Generally, we're part of the planning process. So our input would go into the electrical drawings, and that's what the general contractor would be bidding. And we've found that there are a lot of tricks that we can do to help save developers money, which is also the goal they have in building apartment properties. We've got several tricks of the trade, we like to call them, that will help save developers money in installing their EV charging infrastructure. And
Hmm.
there are some municipalities actually that have fairly strict regulations. In California, you have to have a certain percentage of your property needs to have charging stations open and operating at the time you finish construction, as well as a number of future-proofing sites that they can put charging stations on during the course of, once the property gets leased up and has more demand. But most municipalities at this point do not have any kind of building codes that address EV charging. So you're at liberty to do what you want and how you want to do it.
Interesting. From a cost perspective, are there, is there federal money out there for this infrastructure to build this out so it can, defer some of the costs for developers and owners?
That's a great question. Yes, absolutely. A lot of municipalities have money. A lot of utility companies have got grant programs that we use to, it's part of our service that we give to the developers to help them walk through that grant process and get that capital to help defray the cost of putting in the EV charging infrastructure.
I'm sure you're going to say it depends on this question, but when it comes to grant money, is it usually based on size of the building? Is there a certain allocation on number of stations that they give, or is it a dollar amount? How do they usually look at giving
They're
that
all
money out?
different, but they generally have a couple things in common. It's based on the number of ports that you're putting up, and it also depends on the amount of power that you're seeking in some cases. But every grant is different, and every utility company that gives them out is different, and every municipality that gives them out is different. So
Yeah.
you really need to have somebody who's familiar with that process and working with those providers to help you through the process.
Makes sense. And I got time for one more question, David, but things get outdated. I mean, a lot of the things that we buy, the electrical outlets have, two prongs. We have to go and retrofit for three, right? So how do you future-proof charging stations?
Well, it's really about laying the conduit underneath the ground to get the power from the electrical panel to the ultimate charging stations. Almost every install that we do, we are planning on being able to add more charging stations without having to disrupt the property and run additional conduit. So we look to do it one time and then be able to just add additional stations on.
Makes sense. David, I always enjoy when you come on the show because these conversations that we have together get me off topic a little bit. I'm just thinking about interest rates and refinancing and buildings and properties, but these are fun topics to talk about, and it's definitely something that that everybody is going to be talking about more because electric vehicles are not going to go away. They're going to become more commonplace. So appreciate you coming on the show, David, and we'll see you again very soon.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Take care. Be right back, everybody.